We just saw how React's design lends itself very nicely to testing, and as you're about to see, Redux was designed with testing in mind from the beginning as well. In this module, we'll focus on how to test all of the pieces of Redux. We'll write tests for React components that are connected to all the discrete pieces of Redux, including action creators, thunks, reducers, and the Redux store, which, as you'll see, is just really a final integration test. We'll continue using Mocha and Expect to get this done. We'll begin by writing a test for all of the connected components, so let's get started. Let's continue exploring testing with a more challenging problem. How do we test connected components? When testing React components, there are two core concerns here. First, we can test the component's markup. Given a certain set of props, do we get the expected output? For container components, the surface area should be minimal here. Remember, markup belongs in presentational components, so ideally, the only JSX in a container component is a reference to the child component. Second, we can test the behavior. Given a scroll, click, drag, change, what happens? Do we get the expected behavior? We've already seen some examples of testing the markup, so for testing connected components, let's focus on testing behavior. The tricky thing about testing container components is that they are all wrapped in a call to connect. And the connect function assumes that our app is ultimately wrapped in a provider component. Our container component doesn't export the component that we wrote. Instead, they export the components wrapped in a call to connect. Now, there are two ways to handle this. First, you can wrap the container component with React Redux's provider component within your test. So with this approach, you're actually referencing the store, pass it into the provider, and compose your components under test inside. The advantage of this approach is that you can actually create a custom store for the test. So this approach is useful if you want to test Redux-related portions of your component. But perhaps you don't care about testing Redux-related pieces. If you're merely interested in testing the component's rendering and local state related behaviors, you can simply add a named export for the unconnected plain version of your component. If you forget to do one of those two things when trying to test a container component, you'll at least get a handy error message that guides you in the right direction. Let's go on to test a connected component. Testing a connected React component can be a little tricky at first. Let's start by trying to test the manage course page. So we'll create a new file called managecoursepage.test.js. Let's begin by adding all the necessary imports. These are all the same imports that we used in the previous test, and let's also add in an import for the components that we want to test, which is going to be manage-course-page. Now, as you'll see in a moment, this is going to cause us some problems. So let's write some basic tests so you see what I mean. Let's assume that we're going to add a simple new feature to our application in a TDD or a test-driven development style. We'll write the test first, we'll see it fail, and then add the features that are going to turn it green. And we won't even need to open the browser here to see if the test is working. Let's say that we want our form to set an error message if someone leaves the title field blank when they hit save. Here's the basic shell of a test that we might write. I'm simply testing the manage course page and writing a simple error message that it sets on the form when we try to save an empty title. Now we can use Enzyme to create an instance of the component that we want to test. Next, I'm going to use mount rather than shallow. Remember, shallow is called shallow for a reason. It only renders one deep layer. Here, we need to test the component's interactions with its child's component. So more specifically, the title input that sits inside the course form component. So we need to use mount so that the full DOM is created in memory. Now remember, behind the scenes, Enzyme is using JS DOM to create a virtual in-memory DOM. Now let's try running our test. So it looks like we have an error here. Okay, this is supposed to be page, not pages. And this is actually the error that we're looking for now. So we're presented with our first roadblock here. Since our component is exported as a connected component, if we merely are trying to use it directly, we get an error. Now thankfully, this error is quite helpful. So we have two options. We could wrap our component in a provider component, or we could export them as raw components. I actually prefer the latter approach, so we'll do that one. With this approach, we need to update our component to export a raw unconnected version. This will allow us to text directly without the complexities of setting up Redux's provider and store. To do this, first we need to open up the Manage Course page. And all we need to do is add the export keyword right here. So now we are exporting two different things from this file. We're exporting the plain Manage Course page component, and our default export continues to be connected right down here at the bottom. So we're exporting our connected component by default, or we can use the name component to get our hands on the unconnected component. Now we can go back here to our test, and all I have to do is add curly braces around the Manage Course page, because now what I'm doing is I'm using a named import to reference the class rather than the connected class that is exported by default. So a quite simple change. The great thing about this approach is that it doesn't break any of the existing import statements that we have. Our default import will still work just fine. So now we have our hands on the plain React component, but when we rerun our test, you can see that we still have an error. And the error here is that we cannot read property map of undefined in the select input. So let's open up the select input. And down here, we can see that the select input receives options. And if we go down to our prop types, we can see that options is an array. So we're expecting to be able to iterate over this array, but it's receiving an undefined value because we're not passing down options right down here to our comp in our test. So let's go back to our test, and if this confuses you, remember that mapStateToProps function was taking care of this, but since we're now using the raw component, we need to handle this ourselves. So one simple way that I can do this is just to add authors right here, and then pass in an empty array. And once I hit save, you can see that our tests are passing. Now let's try to get our hands on the save button. So for this test, we want to test that when the user clicks the save button without entering a title, an error is set in state so that the user is aware that the field is required. So let's use Enzyme's find function to find the save button. Since it's the last input on the page, I'm going to use Enzyme's .lastSelector, but as you can see, it still reads quite nicely. Remember, it's searching through the Manage Course page component for all of its children. We could of course grab it by the class or ID if we wanted to. Now let's confirm that we're holding a reference to the save button. We know that it should have a type of submit, so we can confirm that with a test. We'll just say that we expect our save button to have a props type that is submit. No other input on this page will match that filter, and when we save, we can see that it's working. All of our tests are passing, and again, I love how terse Enzyme and expect are. Now, let's use Enzyme's simulate feature to simulate a click on the save button. You can simulate any event that React understands: click, change, blur, etc. Now that we're simulating a click, we're greeted with a new error, and it's saying that it cannot read the property save course of undefined. Now, this is because we're not passing a course in our props. Now that's easy enough to solve. Let's just copy and paste the empty course from the mapStateToProp function over here. I'll go back to the Manage Course page, come down here, and remember in mapStateToProps, we have an empty course that we're defining. So I'll just copy that and paste that in and we'll use it. I'll have to reformat this a little bit, so I'll do that now. And we'll also have to put authors up here. So what we're going to do is just define all of our props up here and in an object, and then pass it down to the Manage Course page right here. So instead of specifying authors, I'm instead going to use the spread operator. And there we go. Now the spread operator here gives us a nice way to pass in all of our props that we're defining up above in our component. Remember earlier that we used the spread operator for copying arrays in our reducer, but the spread operator allows an expression to be handled or expanded anywhere multiple arguments are allowed, such as multiple arguments for function calls, multiple elements for array literals, or multiple variables for deconstructing assignment. Now with this, let's move forward, but we can see that we're still getting an error down here in our console. And now we're greeted with a new error. Now don't be alarmed with the number of errors that we're getting. These are all planned errors. So this says that we cannot read property save course of undefined. Remember, we're defining this function within our map dispatch to props function, so our function isn't getting the expected prop anymore. To fix this, we can just create a simple mock for that. I'll just type it in here. And remember that all of our actions were getting passed down under a property called actions. So I'll define save course under that, and then we can just define it as a function that simply resolves a promise and returns. And this should solve our error. Now we're passing more of the data that's expected for our manage course page component to its children. And you can see that our tests are passing again. Now that we've simulated the click, we want errors to be set. We haven't written the code to do that just yet, but let's go ahead and add the expect. So we're expecting that there will be an error stored in state for the title property that contains this particular text. Now of course, you can see that it fails when I hit save because it's going to be compared to undefined. And this happens because we don't have any of this in our code set up just yet, and that's going to be our next step. Effectively, now we're at a place where we can go ahead and have a TDD experience. We have our test written that once we get this test to pass, we should feel very comfortable that we have successfully built our feature. So now that we have our test all set up, let's add the feature so we can make our test pass. Let's trigger some validation in our save course function, which is right here. And right after prevent default, let's call a validation function that says, hey, is this course form valid? Now we haven't created this function yet, so let's go ahead and do that now. I'll just place this code right above the save course. So what we can do is we can set a boolean that keeps track of whether this form is valid. We can start off by setting it to true, and we're going to have an object that holds all of our errors. What we'll check is if the length of the title that is posted is less than 5 characters. Then we'll go ahead and set an error message. And we'll also note that the form is now invalid. The other thing that we need to do is update set state. Since this is in state, we'll now be storing the updated list of errors within our state. Finally, we return a boolean that determines whether the form is valid so that we know whether to move on in our save course function. And we can see that our tests are passing again, so success. We should be able to check this in our browser and make sure it works. So I'm running test watch right now, so I'll need to come down here and close that out, and I'll say npm start -s. And when we go to the browser and click on courses, I'll hit add course, and I'll hit save, and there you go. It's working perfectly fine. So we can see that we have our validation showing right here. But what I didn't address is how to test Redux related pieces like map state to props. Let's take a look at that in the next video. When working in Redux, the map state to props function can often get large and complicated, especially as we start adding complex filtering, sorting, and mapping to our application. So how do we test it? As you'll see, I prefer to extract significant logic outside to a separate function. So let's see how this can be done. For an example of extracting map state to props, let's look at the map state to props function in the manage course page.js. Here's some logic for formatting author data for the dropdown. Let's extract this to a separate function. So I'm actually just going to remove this from here, and I'll recreate this in a separate folder. So we'll create a new folder and call it selectors. And inside the selectors folder, we'll create a file and we'll call this selectors.js. Now, what I'm going to do is type out a slightly modified version of the code that we just removed. All I have is one function here that I'm exporting, which is authors formatted from dropdown. So I would call this a selector. This is selecting a data, that's why I'm placing it in this selectors folder. So anytime that we have complicated data selection or manipulation code, we can consider placing it in here. And of course, we could always split up this into multiple files like author selectors and course selectors if we find that just one file is getting too big. Now, if you prefer, we can also just export this function from your reducers file. But I appreciate the separation here since it serves a different purpose. Now, we need to update the manage course page component to use this selector inside. So let's just add another import. So I'll jump back up to the top and type this in. And with autofill, it makes it super easy for me. And since the authors formatted from dropdown is a function, we need to pass this the data that it expects, which in this case would be state.authors. Now that we've done this, we can easily test this function. So let's go create a new test file on the selectors folder, and we'll call this selectors.test.js. And I'll just type out the code and I'll explain once I'm finished. So this should look pretty familiar by now. There's nothing really new or novel going on here. We're just asserting that the array is reformatted as expected. Now you might be wondering why I'm using an array here when I only have one author that I'm testing. But this is so if I decide that I want more than one authors to test down the line, I will already have the structure set up to do that. And I'm also testing describe blocks here so that it can display nicely in our results. Oh, and before I run npm test watch, I need to change this back to selectors and it's not authors selectors. Okay, so let's try this out. So great, we can see that all of our tests are passing. The bottom line here is that if you need to run map state to props, consider extracting the complicated pieces into separate selectors, which is really just a name for plain pure functions that are easy to test. So now that we've seen how to test React components using React test utils and enzyme, in the next few clips we'll shift our focus to testing Redux. Now Redux's action creators are so simple that unit testing them is a breeze. So let's jump back into the editor and see how this works. Action creators are conceptually very simple, they just return an object. So unit testing an action creator is actually very simple as well. All we need to do is assert that it returns the expected object. Now before I do this, I will say that I find unit testing something this simple rather silly. We're basically going to end up repeating ourselves verbatim in our test. I find the integration style store test that we'll write at the end of this module more useful, but let's go ahead and write this and you can decide whether it's worthwhile. To begin, we need to create a new test file for course actions. So we'll go over to the actions and say new file courseactions.test.js. And I'll just type this out real quick like usual. So there's nothing new going on up here. We have our imports. Now obviously we're importing action types and actions because we need to have a reference for those. And then I'm just nesting the describe blocks so this will lay out nicely when our tests run. So what you can see that I do here is I set up the course that we're going to pass into our expected action. So our expected action declares the shape of the action that we're looking for. And then we will call the course actions.create course success and pass it in the course that we declare up here. Now of course at the end we just need to assert that our action is going to equal our expected action. It's pretty simple. So this is the code that it takes for us to assert that our function returns an object shape that we're expecting. Now if we rerun our test, oh, it looks like I misspelled expected here, so let me change that. And now we can see that all of our tests are passing, and that's it. There's not much more to say about testing actions. So let's go ahead and test something more interesting, and we'll turn our focus to testing reducers. So now here's the good stuff, unit testing reducers. Since reducers are pure functions, they naturally lend themselves to unit testing. In fact, the creator of Redux, Dan Abramov, said, "One feedback I hear particularly often about Redux is that people who never wrote unit tests for front-end apps started writing them because it is just so easy to test reducers. You don't need to mock any dependencies or simulate AJAX requests because any new data comes in the form of actions." So you can just call the reducer with a state and an action and assert that its output matches exactly what you expect. So testing reducers is as simple as it gets. Given this input, assert this output. Since reducers have no side effects, they're easy to understand and test. In fact, writing reducer tests is so simple that you can even automate the creation of reducer tests using a library called Redux Test Recorder. Now, this project is currently experimental and the API might change. So I'm not going to use it in this course, but just the fact that it does exist says something about the simplicity of reducers. So let's jump back into the code and create our first reducer test. We're looking at a course reducer file, so let's create some tests for it. We'll come over here to our reducers folder and we'll create the course reducer.test.js file. And we need to add some imports to get started. First, let's import expect. We'll also need a reference to our system under our test, so we need to add a reference to course reducer file. We'll also need a reference to the related course actions file. Now, our course reducer handles the creating and updating of courses. So first, let's create a test for how it handles the create course success action. To begin, let's describe the file that we're about to test, which is the course reducer. Then, we need to name our test, so we'll call it should add course when passed create course success. And now we're ready to write our test. Note that I'm not going to create a full course object here since we don't need all the properties. So instead, for the initial state, I'm going just to put the title for each of these. So that's all we need to be able to run our test for now. Now, we will need a new course to work with here, so I'll just create a new const, call it new course, and this course will have a different title. Let's just put in here C, for example. And the final thing we need to do is add a reference to our action. So we can call actions.createCourseSuccess, and we'll pass it in the new course that we just defined up above. So we have our arrange section all set up, and now we can go on to the act. To act, what we need to do is declare a constant called newState, and now we can call our course reducer. And anytime that we call our course reducer, we need to pass it in initial state, which is in this case going to be the initial state that I declared up above. And the action, which we also declared up above in our range. So this completes our action, and now we're ready to begin our assertions. The first thing we need to do is we should be able to assert that there are 3 items in state. So let's begin by saying expect new state.length to equal 3 because we're expecting there to be 3 items in state. Now at this point, it might be nice just to run npm test watch so we can see if we're in good shape so far. So great, it looks like all of our tests are passing. We're going to put in a few more expect statements in here because there's some more things that we should assert in this test. Another thing that we can do is say the first element in the array should expect a certain title. So we expect the title to equal A. Now if I hit save, you can see that we're still passing. And in fact, we can copy and paste this down, and I could check the second and the third element as well. So when I hit save, we can see that we have all of our tests and everything's still good, so it's still pretty straightforward. We could do something pretty similar to test update as well. I'm going to add in a final update and then we can talk about the differences. Obviously, the first thing you'll notice is our name is different. You can also see that I've added a little bit of extra data here because we do need an ID so that we can get our hands on these records and test them properly. Of course, when we're updating a course, our reducer needs to be able to have that data to update it. I like this principle of just specifying the data that we need here though. It also helps our test be a little bit more readable. And now you can see below, we're just asserting the updated course title is equal to the new title that we specified and that the untouched course didn't have a title that was changed. Also, we're making sure that the length of our array of new state is what's expected. We expect it to have 3, So it proves that we didn't accidentally assert a record when we thought that we were updating. And we still see that all of these tests are passing, so great. And that's pretty much it. As you can see, testing reducers is pretty straightforward. So now let's take a look at testing thunks. Thunks handle async calls, often dispatch multiple actions, and also often interact with web APIs. This makes them a little trickier to test. So to test a thunk, I'm going to require some mocking. We need to mock two things, the store and any HTTP calls that we make. We'll mock the store using the Redux mock store library, and you can mock any HTTP calls using knock, which stands for node mock. Now in our app, we're already using a mock API that doesn't actually generate HTTP calls, so we don't need to use knock, but I'll show you how to set it up regardless. So let's go back to the editor and write our first thunk test. To test our first thunk, let's open up our course actions test file. So to test our first thunks, we need to add some imports up here at the top of our file. We're going to need to have Redux thunk and mock, which I mentioned earlier is for mocking HTTP calls, and finally a call to Redux mock store, which lets us configure a mock store. And we'll put our test for thunks down here below. To begin, I'm going to configure our mock store. Our mock store takes in an array of middleware. The only middleware that we need to work with this is Redux thunk. So I'm declaring an array with just Redux thunk inside, and that will give us a mock store right here. And with that prep work done, we're ready to begin writing our test. We're going to describe this as async actions, but I'm also going to define here an after each function because it's important with knock that after each call that we clean our API. So we'll call this clean all. We're going to describe this as async actions, but I'm also going to define here an after each function because it's important with knock that after each call we call clean all. And that just performs a cleanup after each one of our tests is run. So now with that done, we're ready to write the body of our test. The name of this test is going to be pretty long. So we'll say it should create begin Ajax call and load courses success when loading courses. Now at this point, as a part of our test setup, we would call knock, but I'm going to show you what a real API call would look like using knock, but I'll comment this out because we don't need it for our mock API. If we were hitting the actual API, then I would define the precise URL that we're planning on hitting for this test. And what knock would do is capture that call and then instead return this fake response instead with all of the hard-coded data that we have. But again, since we're hitting a mock API, I'm just going to skip this step and it's not necessary for us. Next, let's declare the array of actions that we're expecting as a part of this thunk. So there are two actions that we expect. We're expecting begin Ajax call and load courses success. And within the load courses success, we're expecting this payload to be a part of it, which is just the body with the courses and then this data within the list of courses. Just one course with this inside. So this is effectively our test data that we're setting up here in the arrange section of our test. So for the next step, we'll need to put this mock store to use. So what I'm doing on this line is I'm calling the mock store and sending it some initial state and the action that we're expecting. So this line puts our mock store to use. Now we're ready to dispatch from our store and see what happens. So what we're doing here is that we're dispatching the load courses call and then calling store.getActions to get our list of actions. And this finally allows us to make our assertions. We will assert that the first action is begin Ajax call and the second action is load courses success. And then finally, we can use this callback right here to declare that we're done. And that completes our asynchronous flow. And with that, we should be able to open up the terminal and run our test. And great, we see that it's all still passing. There is one problem though. You can see that it took me 1007 milliseconds, and if this is a slow test, then it gets labeled on this list. The reason that it's slow is because remember, we have a 1 second delay that we put on our mock API call. So one thing that we can do is go in and open our delay.js file and change it from 1000 to 0. And when I hit save, now our tests are passing very quickly and it no longer is listed as a slow test. So we're in good shape. Now let's move on to testing the store.